Well, hello again to my lovely viewers. This time I'll be doing a bit of a book comparison. So I'll be looking at three books. So these three right here. I'll show you those on the screen as well. So these are books on waiting. So if you're Canadian, Reform Book Services has them at here $16. This one, Seasons of Waiting, is $13. And then Wait and Hope, Puritan Wisdom for Joyful Suffering, is $13. So pretty good price actually for all three books. And you could say I was going through a period of waiting, and might even say, I am currently in a period of waiting as well. So that's why I bought three books on waiting. And perhaps before I go into what each of those books cover, what I liked about each of them and what I think their strong suits are, maybe I should cover, what is waiting from a biblical perspective. Very briefly anyway, because the books will cover it. So if we do look at Psalm 13, I think Psalm 13 covers it well. Just the first two verses. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? And then the rest of the psalm, it goes into, consider and answer me. I've trusted in the Lord. And then the psalm ends with joy. But I think as Christians, people generally, but as Christians, we also recognize that waiting is difficult. A lot of times, life is full of waiting, and it's sometimes hard to wait for good things. So these books, they do give some good counsel on how to wait well, and I think that's the hard part there. Psalm 13 talks about, how long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? So waiting for a good thing can feel like that. There's just sorrow in your hearts all day long. You're counseling in your soul, right? Going back and forth about how can I wait? What can I do? And these three books, they all give different perspectives. So the first book I'm going to cover will be Seasons of Waiting. That's by Betsy Child Howard. And I think originally this book was intended for women. It's written by a woman for women. And she starts off with Proverbs 13:12. I think that's another great verse to consider. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. So there, I think we all know that feeling of disappointment. You've waited long for this one thing. You might even get a taste of it, and then it's taken away. So disappointment comes, your hope is deferred, and your heart, it just drops. It makes the heart sick. So and I did find this was a helpful book. I really enjoyed her examples, actually. If I could show you her table of contents. Here, she talks about waiting in general, first of all. So there she talks about the Proverbs verse. She also talks about how it's easy to become apathetic. If I could see... Well, I'm not quite sure what quote I was looking for there, but she prefaces it with, the school of waiting, and then she gives some practical examples, right? So, waiting for a bridegroom, waiting for a child, waiting for healing during times of sickness, waiting for a home, waiting for a prodigal. So prodigal, not just a child, but even if like a husband or a spouse or someone, a family member, is either not a Christian or just blatantly sins, waiting for their return. And then some sort of concluding thoughts. So how does a Christian wait, and then when the wait is over, then what do Christians actually wait for? So there, she makes a really good point at the beginning that, you can have these persistent longings after all those good things. And the Bible, it doesn't always just say, be content no matter what. Because you can long for a good thing. So she uses the example of like Hannah. Hannah, she longs for a child. So she prays. She prays for a child. She weeps. And then the Lord hears her prayer and gives her Samuel as a son. But you might imagine, right? What if Hannah just said, okay, this is my lots from the Lord. Therefore, I'm just going to learn to be content. Well, I guess we wouldn't know. We wouldn't know what would happen to Israel without Samuel as a prophet. And it's a lot of what ifs. But it does show that, even though that Hannah was barren, she did pray for a son. There is that longing for a good thing. There's not just, you have to accept things as they are. Some things, we bring it to the Lord. And really what her book covers is, waiting well. Waiting well doesn't mean waiting without pain. And then the length of the wait, that makes it harder, right? We know we're waiting for this good thing. We know that God gives good things. But then, when? When is God going to give that thing? And I think that's the hardest part. Because if you're just waiting, I don't know, a couple hours for a text or for a reply, you can wait for it. Or if you have like a medical exam, you don't have to wait maybe a week or two before you can go in or for the results. All right, you know when to expect it. But with God, right, sometimes you just pray and you wait. You want a spouse or child or home. But when? When is God going to give that? That adds to the pain of waiting. So she does talk about how it's hard to wait without becoming impatient or becoming cynical. And I think that's an important thing to address as well, because in this day and age, there is no waiting really, right? Amazon Prime, you click it, your package comes in like the next day, maybe 2 days. Fast food and everything else. We've been trained to not wait anymore. But throughout the Bible, you see this trend that people have to wait. It's not like prayers are answered instantly, except for maybe Acts 12 where Peter is delivered. That's an example of a swiftly answered prayer. But in most cases, the pattern has been that God's people have to wait. And towards the end of the book, she does go over each case, right? And it's so helpful because she does have real life examples. So she doesn't use their real name, but she has friends who are waiting for like a husband, for a child, or for a home. How do they wait faithfully? And here she talks about how Christians are sustained while we wait. So daily manna, the Israelites, they had to gather just enough manna for each day. And they had to do it every day except for the Sabbath. So likewise, as Christians should go to God. Each day they wait. And then, you go each day. God will give enough grace for each day. There's that principle of daily manna. And God, He likes it. He loves it when His children lean into Him for strength. So Christians, lean upon God. That's her encouragement. And really, she points Christians to this hope that waiting will end one day. So maybe one day God does give that child or that spouse or home. But when you receive it, don't let that make you more comfortable in the world. So though you finally received what you were waiting for, that waiting had taught you, right, that the world, it's not your home. That thing that you're waiting for, it's not the end all and be all. That thing that you're waiting for, don't let Satan turn God's blessing into an idol. You might have waited years for a spouse or for a child, but that's still God's blessing, and it doesn't take the place of God. So, really, waiting, it points Christians to, that greater weight. She concludes that conclusion there. What are we waiting for? And they're a bit of a Sunday school answer, right? Ultimately, we're all waiting for Jesus. For Jesus to return, one day we'll be made whole. You might go through your whole life without any of these things. These prayers might not even be answered in this lifetime. But, when Jesus comes back, then you'll be made full. And I think that is a little bit of a hard truth to swallow sometimes. Because, you have a good longing. You want that good thing. But, if God doesn't give it, then that's tough. If I can go back to over there, I thought in particular she had a great example for all of them, really. Like, there's a great example of, like, healing and sickness. There's this Christian couple. The husband, he has, like, cancer. battles with it for like 15 or 16 years, but faithfully serves while he's sick. And in one sense, the prayer wasn't answered for healing, but he did have more years than expected, and he used those years faithfully. And then the other one was for a prodigal. There's this woman, a wife, but her husband has become unfaithful and adulterous. He's run off. And then she just prays and prays, and he doesn't come back. But it was a lesson that still grew that woman in her faith. So I found like her real life examples and really walking together with these other people who've been waiting for prayers to be answered. It was very helpful. So greatly enjoyed this book. I'll talk a little bit more about, out of the three, I guess what I like about the three and what I recommend about them. The second one is Waiting Isn't a Waste by Mark. I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name. I don't want to try to butcher it. But here, his last name though is actually, I believe it in Dutch, it means like early riser. So he talks about how waiting is hard for him as well. And throughout the book, he talks about learning to wait well. Because for him, he's that go-getter. Wakes up early, wants to get things done. He's a leader, wants to get things done. So he's always on the move. And let's, check off these things. Let's get things done. But waiting is tough. And he covers 6 principles of how we wait. So here in his table of contents, he introduces the topic of waiting. He says how it's not a waste. Oftentimes waiting grows Christians. And then his 6 principles are, honesty, waiting is hard. Frequently, waiting is common. Thoughtfully, waiting is biblical. Patiently, waiting is slow. Intentionally, waiting is commanded. And then 6, collectively, waiting is relational. And then some concluding thoughts as well. So, might be a little bit of a bias, but because I read Seasons first, I enjoyed Seasons a little bit more. He does quote Seasons in this book as well, so maybe a little bit of a bias that Seasons is the slightly better read. But I think they are a little bit different. So he does talk a little bit more about how to use these principles. How do you wait honestly, right? It's good to not deny your feelings that, if you are waiting for a good thing and it frustrates you a bit that, God hasn't given it to you, well, don't be in denial. You bring it before God. And then frequently, it's clear that waiting is common in the Christian life. There are many examples in the Bible of people waiting. Even Israel, they wait for a Savior. And you consider how long it takes before Christ finally comes in the flesh, right? So even then, there's a long period of waiting. Likewise, for Christians, there's many periods of waiting. So again, with Betsy's book, Seasons of Waiting, there's all those examples of like a spouse, a child, a home, for prodigals, for salvation of friends and family. A lot of the Christian life is waiting. And then thoughtfully, so waiting with hope, he sort of equivalates it to the word in the Hebrew he says is the same. So wait and hope, those 2 words are the same. So though you wait, you have hope. You're hoping in the Lord. You're looking towards the things that are not seen. He has this acronym of FAST. So F for focus, A for adore, S for seek, T for trust. So the acronym is, you focus on God, you adore God, you seek God, and you trust God. And there's a quote on page 67. So sometimes we do reject God. God's good. C.S. Lewis, he says, it seems to me that we often sulkily reject the good that God offers us because at the moment we expected some other good. So as we wait, sometimes we have preconceptions of, this is how God's going to answer that prayer as I wait. But oftentimes when God does answer that prayer, sometimes it's a bit different from what we expected, and then we reject it, we spurn it. It's like, oh, I didn't ask for this. But we have to trust God's wisdom. God's wisdom is better than ours, and if God gives a good thing, it is a good thing, even if it's not what we expect. And then the point there, he talks about intentionally. What does it mean to wait intentionally? So embracing waiting as a choice. So he says, we respond with faith, not just worry or anxiety or anger or apathy, but it's a daily practice, right? We prepare, we wait, and then you plan to wait on the Lord. You recognize that Not everything's going to come just like that. But, if you pray, you're going to wait and expect to see this answer from God. Another book on prayer that I read talks about how, if you pray for something, you start to look for it. So it's almost like if you were to buy like a blue car, then you start to recognize all of a sudden all the blue cars on the road. You're more aware of it. Likewise, when you pray, then you start to look for God's reply. You start to see, has God answered my prayer? So he doesn't mention that in this book, but I think that's a helpful example of what it means to plan to wait and respond with faith, right? Once you pray for that thing, then you start to look, where is God starting to answer my prayer? And I think his last point, collective waiting is relational. I think that's a great point to make, because the Christian life, we don't live it on our own. But, if you're walking alongside brothers and sisters in a church, and you realize, you're not the only one waiting for something good. Oftentimes, your brothers and sisters in Christ are also waiting for something good from the Lord. So, that's an encouragement there, that you're not just waiting alone, and that waiting together, it does help make that process a little bit easier, a little bit better. You can encourage one another. And he concludes, waiting is connected oftentimes with like control. So we like to be in control, but waiting, it forces us to remind ourselves that only God is in control. And he talks a little bit about how waiting it's not optional. So most of the Christian life, it really is just waiting. Patience, it's a Christian virtue. So here, if it's not optional, then the worst thing you can do is to try to fight against it. If you recognize that it's, just a mandatory thing, then it's better to go, not so much go along with the flow, but, recognize it and to learn how to wait well. And he talks about a few other things there as well. We recognize that God works while we wait. So we might not see it, but God does work while we wait. So overall, another helpful book, a lot of principles. I found fewer examples than Seasons of Waiting, but some good principles to keep in mind and good collective examples as well. And then the last book, Wait and Hope, by Jacob Tanner, and the subtitle Puritan Wisdom for Joyful Suffering. This one I found was interesting, because I think, if I'm honest, it was a little bit broad of a book. So he does incorporate Puritan wisdom. He talks about how the Puritans, they saw the earth not as a place to escape from, but a battlefield to advance upon with the sword of God's word. And he talks a little bit about the importance of killing sin, how Christ delights in us as we do that, how help comes from God to kill, help us kill our sin. In terms of like actual patience, yes, he does acknowledge that God is sovereign over all things. Providence, the Puritans had a high view of providence, so God is in control of all things, and even our waiting is in God's hands. So we can trust God that even though we don't know what he's doing, we know that all things are working out for our good. We know that we're not just waiting for something that won't come in one sense. It might not come in our lifetime, but there he sort of points to that future redemption. All things will be restored when Christ returns. And actually, I should show the table of contents as well to sort of prove my point. So here you can see killing sin first, then battling, assurance, what if you have unbelief. So chapter 3 there, it kind of talks a little bit about waiting, so remembering God's sovereignty when the world spins out of control. There's a bit of like perseverance, right? If you encounter like shame or persecution, if you're living as like an outcast or as a pilgrim. So not directly waiting per se. Then he deals with sickness. And then towards the end, actually, I found it was, you can see chapters 9 and 10, weeping tarries for the night, joy comes in the morning. It dealt a little bit more with like Christian joy. So here, I was a little bit torn on this book because, I do love the Puritans. Puritans are great. So this book, it was a bit of a mix of many things. It covers, holiness, covers persevering in the faith despite hardships, suffering for your faith even. Covers some of waiting, and then it covers, joy. So I don't know, the little part there, joyful suffering, that's almost like a whole part in itself. But compared to the other two books, there's a little bit less of waiting in this book than I anticipated. So I probably didn't summarize this book as much, and I'll explain a little bit more about that as I talk about their strengths. So Seasons of Waiting, I found it was more practical. I think I do have a little bit of a bias because I read this one first, so maybe it just made the other one seem less spectacular. But I think waiting is such a practical thing, right? So having those principles down and then showing examples of that, I found quite helpful. Maybe it helps, if I've been reading a lot more of those theoretical things and just having a practical book. So I do admit, maybe I do have a bias, but I think out of all of them, Seasons of Waiting, it was my favorites. I really enjoyed those real life examples and really just hearing about good examples of how other Christians waited in other cases. Like waiting for a child, waiting for a spouse, waiting despite sickness for many, many years, even though they didn't get it, in this lifetime. How did they wait? And how did they wait hopefully and faithfully? So I found that was a great strength of this one, that it was practical and that it really shows, how Christians should wait. For waiting with hope, or waiting isn't a waste, sorry. This one, again, I found the principles were good. I found his examples weren't quite as strong. Towards the end, he talks a little bit about how he, as an early riser, he wanted to go see this sunrise with his family. But because of his poor planning, his wife takes his kids back to the car. There's a bus that pulls up with a bunch of tourists, so it wasn't that quiet sunrise that he envisioned. But through it, he still says that instead of going back to the car to try to ask if his family would join him for the sunrise, he just decided to wait. And then it was an amazing experience, as he saw that sunrise by himself, and he was drawn to worship. But I found it wasn't like the most hopeful picture, right? It still seemed a little bit soured. So I felt like some illustrations could have been a little bit stronger. And I'm not sure I really enjoyed it as much as I did. So there are a lot of true things that he wrote in this book, but in terms of, does it help me wait a little better? Yes and no. I think we understand that, we want to wait. Of course, yes, we know we should read the Bible and seek God in prayer, which he does mention, right? But in a sense, how does that really help us wait with hope? How is it not a waste? So he does address that too, how to be fair. Learning to embrace waiting, that does help us and shape us. But I found it wasn't as strong. And then this one, as I mentioned, I felt like it, Wait and Hope, I felt like it just tried to do a little bit too much. So in terms of tackling the topic of waiting, it did a bit. It tried to talk a little bit more about general Christian living, Christian life. So I think for someone who's interested in the Puritans, this book is actually a bit of an interesting starter per se. You're able to sort of get a few quotes from various Puritans, some of their writings, right? He talks a little bit about assurance, and of course the Puritans, they write beautifully, so he does use quotes well. I will give him that. But towards the end, I think it turned into spiritual depression for the last two chapters. He quotes Lloyd Jones, a little bit about unbelief, how that's sort of the root of our anxiety sometimes, or our lack of joy. But again, right, if I'm learning to wait, I understand, yes, there's some sorrow mixed in with it, but the Puritans, what exactly did they write about waiting? I'm not so sure, you could make a full book out of it, which is maybe why you had to go a little bit more broad. But again, I think here, I'm not so sure, right? So I guess if you take it as, joyful suffering overall, then yes, I guess he actually did accomplish that topic. But as a book on waiting, I think it's a bit, not misleading per se, but it's not focused on waits, right? If I were to say wait and blot out that last part too, then yes, that'd be true. So out of these books, I think I do recommend Betsy Child Howard's. She does a great job of highlighting, the difficulties of waiting, some of the common pitfalls, right? We fall into anger or apathy. But then ultimately, when Christ returns, then our waiting will be worth it. And even when you get that thing that you're waiting for, you have to be reminded, right? This world, it's not my home. Now that I've received it, that doesn't become my sole focus. I was waiting, right, for God to answer. I wait upon God. So I do recommend one. It would be this. I don't even know if I could put a second or a third. I think these just have different functions. So if you want something a little bit more structured, go with Waiting Isn't the Waste. And then if you want a little bit of an intro to Puritan writings and spiritual depression, both of which I do love, then this is a decent book. But otherwise, Seasons of Waiting, number 1. So that's it for this video. A little bit more of a briefer comparison. I do apologize if it seems a little bit scattered. I read these books a little bit while back, and I didn't make as many notes as I did back then, so I had to briefly review it today. But I do hope that some of these books will be helpful, right? Because waiting, all of them really admit that waiting is not easy. There's a lot of suffering in waiting, and it humbles us. It forces us to depend upon God and really wait on God. And waiting, it's never natural. I think as children, you understand. They always ask, when are we going to get there? It's hard to wait as a child. And as you get older, that doesn't really change, right? When am I going to find a spouse? When am I going to get married? When am I going to get a home? When am I going to get children? When am I... there's always something else. When, God? How long, oh God? And I think oftentimes the Christian life, it's filled with trials. How long, O Lord, must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? Psalm 13, that's your go-to psalm, right, if you're in a period of waiting. So I think we all do long for that sorrow to be taken out of our hearts. And it will temporarily on earth. But ultimately, when Christ returns, then yes, that sorrow will be gone from our hearts. No longer do we take counsel in our souls anymore. But until that day, we wait with hope, we wait faithfully, and really, we wait in faith. We wait well. So that's it for this video. Thank you again for watching, and see you in the next video. Grace to you and peace.